Hi there, everyone. Welcome back to another AP Psychology video. We have 3 modules we are going to get through today in this video, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. Let's go ahead and get started here. We are looking at modules 62, which is about our section of the unit on personality still, and module 62 is about our trait theories. Module 63 is about our social cognitive theories. And then module 64 is about exploring the self and self-concept, what all of that means. So let's go ahead and get started with module 62. I'm gonna just go through a couple of things a little bit quickly here. Not gonna show you every single slide. So first, let's stop here with what is a trait. This is definitely one of those formal definitions that you should know. A trait is a characteristic pattern of behavior or a disposition to feel and act in certain ways. And it can be assessed by self-report inventories or peer reports. So self-report is any kind of like survey you might do where it asks you questions and you answer how you're feeling, anything like that. That's a self-report thing. Peer reports is asking other people. So think about it. Are you logical? Are you emotional? Are you solid, unreliable, hilarious, moody? What would you use to describe yourself? How would you characterize yourself? So, first question right off the bat here. I have a good feeling about this one. Which of the following is the best term or phrase for a characteristic pattern of behavior or a disposition to feel and act? What do you think? You got it. Letter E, trait. That is the only thing we've talked about so far. So, you are in fact correct. So, how do psychologists use traits to describe personality? If you think back to the last video talking about psychoanalytic and humanistic theories of personality, they were really trying to kind of describe, um, to explain why we have certain traits and everything, why we are the way we are. They want to describe and explain the way our personality is rather than just labeling it. Trait theorists just do that labeling part of it. So a couple of people here, Gordon Allport, Isabel Briggs Myers, and her mother, Catherine Briggs, were concerned less with explaining individual traits and more with just describing them. So they just wanted to put a label to traits rather than, well, how did you come to be this way? And why do you act a certain way? So tests that are used to sort people into different personality types, like the Myers-Briggs type indicator, if you've ever heard of that before. It's a very commonly known personality test, I would say. Those have been used in business and career counseling, but also might not be super valid. So a lot of people like to use the Myers-Briggs test, but it's not necessarily the most valid test, actually. So some limitations of relying on traits to classify individuals include the fact that that doesn't necessarily capture someone's full individuality and like every aspect of you. So we're each a unique, complex, multiple traits and everything. It's really hard to say like you are just these kinds of things. There's a lot more that goes into that. So some people then place several trait dimensions simultaneously rather than just saying like you are this thing or something like that. So for example, here we've got Hans and Sybil Isink, who believed we can reduce many of our normal individual variations to 2 dimensions. On one side, we've got extroversion, on the other is introversion. And on one side, in terms of emotional stability, we've got stable and unstable. So they kind of argue that people can fall somewhere in this scale of introversion, extroversion, stable and unstable, that they kind of could fall into one of these quadrants here. And this idea has been tested through the Ising personality questionnaire. That's one I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about, but is something you should just kind of generally be aware of. I do want to talk about the difference between introversion and extroversion, though, because they are important traits to make sure you understand. A very common misconception of introversion is that to be introverted means that you are shy. That is not true. You could be both introverted and shy, but someone who's extroverted could also be shy. Introversion and extroversion instead have some kind of like formal definitions of introversion being you lose energy when you're around other people. So being around a lot of people can really drain you. It requires a lot of attention from you. So like a lot of stimulation is too much for you. It might be that you prefer to be on your own. That doesn't mean that people who are extroverted don't ever like to be alone, But extroversion does mean that you gain energy from being around people. So if you're someone who's extroverted and you're then at a party where there's a bunch of people around, you are gaining so much energy and you're feeling good. That's your place you like to be when people are around you and everything. Whereas someone who's introverted, they might also be at a party. It's not that they're shy necessarily. It's just that being around a lot of people and being super outgoing around them, they could still be that way. However, it probably takes a lot of their energy if you are someone who is introverted. So just be sure that you are aware of introversion and extroversion and you're not having any misconceptions about what they mean. So, what is a personality inventory? That is something that we use to try to measure or assess traits specifically. So, again, like I was saying, this could be a lot of self report surveys. So, any kind of objective questionnaire, which a lot of times has true, false, or agree, disagree items rather than it being like you writing out an open ended answer. It's more like on a scale of this to this, how do you feel type of thing. So this can definitely be used to assess personality traits. The most common personality inventory you definitely need to know about is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, also known as the MMPI. It does have, I believe, two versions now currently. So there's the MMPI 1 and the MMPI 2. So the big takeaway you should know with the MMPI is that it is the most widely researched and clinically used of all objective personality tests. It is a test we really like to use in the field of personality. It is also used very commonly and most commonly used now today to identify emotional disorders. So you'll kind of see this again in our next unit on clinical psychology, but it can also be used in a more casual situation like with employment. As I was applying for jobs as a teacher, actually, I do remember needing to complete like personality surveys where they would have me do probably either part of the MMPI or some kind of similar survey. So sometimes it can be used for like jobs as well. There's a lot of other information here on these slides about the MMPI. Honestly, I don't think you really need to know a lot of the specifics about it. The big things to know is that it is the most commonly used personality test. So you should know that. And a lot of times it's used to identify emotional or personality disorders. So I'm going to skip over these couple of things here, except I do want to mention this phrase empirically derived. Anytime you see the word empirical, that basically means it's scientific. It is something that is research backed. It goes through the scientific method. It's not just some kind of like subjective observations you see, but rather it's more objective and uses science behind it. So the MMPI is one example of that. It's kind of science based. Again, I'm going to skip a couple of things there. So some people though say that the Eysenck's assessment of personality of saying you're on a dimension of this trait here or this trait here, just two things, doesn't tell the whole story. So then come along Robert McCrae and Paul Costa, who then came up with 5 different dimensions of personality traits, which we very commonly call the big 5 traits of personality. So let's take a look at those. You can use 2 different acronyms to remember these 5 different traits they have. One is the word CANOE, because the 5 words are conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. And those all, if you put the first letters together, spell CANOE. Also, fun little thing here, you could rearrange them and spell the word ocean as well. So either remembering an ocean or canoe, basically anything to do with water, can help you remember what are the 5 different traits here in the big 5 personality factors. You should absolutely know what each of these 5 are. So let's kind of talk about them quickly. The first is conscientiousness, which is basically looking at, are you someone who is highly organized? You pay great attention to detail, very goal-oriented and driven to succeed. So for all of these, it's pretty much like you fall on a scale of each of these. So for the trait of conscientiousness, are you someone who is highly conscientious or do you fall on the lower end of the conscientiousness scale? Next, we have the trait of agreeableness. Agreeableness is people who are cooperative, empathetic, and caring. They enjoy helping and being part of a group. So you do well with like accepting other people's ideas and everything. Then we have neuroticism, which is basically looking at what is your emotional stability like. So if you are high in neuroticism, that means you don't have very good emotional stability. It means you probably have a lot of mood swings and can be very irritable. You might also worry about a lot of things and get upset and anxious easily. Openness are people who are creative and adventurous. They enjoy trying new things and taking on new challenges. So you really enjoy like new opportunities. And finally, extroversion, as we kind of already talked about, pretty much it's either you're high on the scale of extroversion, or if you're low in extroversion, you're more of that introversion. So extroversion is people who are outgoing and gain energy from being with others. You like to meet new people, start conversations, and have a wide variety of friendships. So as you can see on this chart here, the column on the left is all of the traits that go with people who are lower in each of those 5 categories. And then the right column is people who are high in each of those things. You don't have to be high in all of them. Like you could be high in conscientiousness, but low in agreeableness, or anywhere else on that scale. So that is your big 5 traits. Either remember canoe or ocean, and that is, I'm blanking on their names. That is Robert McCrae and Paul Costa. There you go. So remember those 2 together, please. You can do this on your own, but I'm going to skip here. You can see a little bit more. Where do you fall on the big 5 traits? All right, question number 2 for you. Jane refuses to cheat on an exam that many of her friends have shown her copies of. Jane would rank high on the big 5 trait of which of these different options here? If you need to, pause, go back and look at that chart with the traits. This one would be letter A, conscientiousness. If she is high in conscientiousness, she likely would not cheat on that exam there. So are personality traits consistent over time? In a lot of ways, yes. It seems like your personality is generally pretty stable. Children who are cheerful and friendly tend to also become cheerful, friendly adults. But of course, a fun-loving jokester can suddenly turn serious and respectful at a job interview. So the environment absolutely affects your personality on a day-to-day basis. So kind of over time, we generally see that personality is stable, but depending on situational factors, you might show different traits in your personality, the way that you express your traits. I'm going to skip this. You can take a look at that on your own. As I said, personality is pretty stable, and those traits become even more stable as you get older. Do traits equal behaviors? Personality traits might be both stable and strong. The consistency of our specific behaviors, though, from one situation to the next is another matter. Again, that's kind of commenting on what I was just saying, how it depends on what other situational factors are happening of which parts of your personality you decide to show. So for example, if you're with a group of people that you know and love super well, they're your best friends, you're probably going to be a little more true to yourself and show those personality traits more. If you walk into a room full of people who you have never met in your life, you might act a little differently if you don't know any of them. If you're someone who's extroverted, you might still act pretty similarly, but you can definitely show different personality traits in different situations. All right, very cool. We are done with module 62 there on our trait theories of personality. So we're moving right along to module 63 with our social cognitive theories now. Still talking about personality. What is the social cognitive perspective? It views behavior as influenced by the interaction between people's traits, including their thinking, and their social context. So it's like, how do people's thoughts and everything interact with your social context? Remember, nature and nurture work together, so do individuals and their situations. And again, that kind of comments on what we were just saying too. So the behavioral approach basically falls kind of under this category of social cognitive. It's slightly different, but it's same general ideas. And it states that we are conditioned to repeat certain behaviors, and we learn by observing and imitating others. So a child with a very controlling parent might learn to follow orders rather than thinking independently, and then might exhibit a more timid personality. So let's look now, how do the behavioral and social cognitive approaches kind of relate to each other? Social cognitive theorists consider our behavioral perspective. They do kind of agree that's true, believing that we learn many of our behaviors through conditioning or by observing and imitating others. But social cognitive theorists also emphasize the importance of mental processes. So it's not just your own behaviors, but also your thoughts. How does what you think affect situations and your behavior? So we're not just looking solely at how the environment controls us, but social cognitive theorists focus on how we and our environment interact. So behaviors are more just what does the environment do to your behavior? Social cognitive more is okay, but also vice versa. How do we affect our environment? How does our environment affect us? And that is where this idea of reciprocal determinism comes in. Reciprocal determinism is the idea that behavior, internal cognition, and environment all interact and influence each other. So any kind of like things that are happening are likely the result of the fact that your own personality traits and your thoughts probably impact your environment and are impacted by your environment, which also impacts your behavior and are impacted by your behavior. So all those things just kind of work together. It's a two-way street with all of them. That's the idea of reciprocal determinism. You should make sure you pair this with Albert Bandura. Quick pop quiz for you. What other big experiment is he known for? Think that we are still talking about like social cognitive and behavior stuff. Albert Bandura was our Bobo doll guy. Remember the children like being aggressive towards the Bobo doll? So just a little review for you there. But he's kind of the one that was also talking about reciprocal determinism there. So specific ways where individuals and environments interact. Different people can choose different environments, what kinds of things you choose to do. Your personalities also shape how you interpret and react. And your personalities create situations to which you react as well. So there's a lot of that reciprocal determinism going on. And also don't forget about our biopsychosocial approach, as always, which applies to just about everything in psychology. You want to make sure you are pulling in your biological side, psychological, and social cultural influences for analyzing the traits that go along with personality. I'm going to skip over this because it's pretty similar to what we were saying with reciprocal determinism. And what else here? I'm going to go over that one too. So what are some of the criticisms of social cognitive theorists? One thing that critics say is that they focus so much on the situation that they fail to appreciate the person's inner traits. So they're saying you're thinking so much about the environment, but what about the person too? Where is the person in this view of personality, and where are human emotions? That's something other people tend to ask. They've also been faulted for underemphasizing the importance of the unconscious motives, emotions, and biologically influenced traits. Who do you think are the people that would probably give that criticism there? That would be your psychoanalysts. Perfect. They're the ones that really focus on your unconscious mind. All right, you can look through that on your own. That's a little more of an FRQ practice there. But boom, we are moving right through this. Just covered module 63 as well. We are ending off here with module 64. By the way, I hope this whole time you've been filling in your Unit 7 slide deck as we go. If not, rewind if you need to fill stuff in. Keep going from here. So we are on our last module for this unit of motivation, emotion, and personality. Module 64 is all about exploring the self. So the concept of self dates back to at least William James, if you remember him, who talked a lot about it in his Principles of Psychology book. Gordon Allport also said that the self had become lost to view. Humanistic psychology's later emphasis on the self did not instigate much scientific research, but it did help renew the concept of self and keep it alive. So what exactly are we talking about? The self today is one of Western psychology's most vigorously researched topics. So we're definitely more focused on that now. And there's always lots of studies coming out that have to do with self-esteem, self-disclosure, self-awareness, self-schema, self-monitoring, et cetera, et cetera. So is there actually a place in the brain where your sense of self is located? They have found through neuroscientist labs and everything that your sense of self a lot of times becomes activated somewhere in a central frontal lobe region. So kind of right here where my mouse is, That's an area that tends to kind of become active and light up when people respond to self-reflective questions about their traits and dispositions. So, okay, what the heck is the self? What is it? That's what we want to know. Today, in contemporary psychology, we say that it is the center of our personality, the organizer of our thoughts, feelings, and actions. And it basically answers the question, well, who am I? That is kind of your sense of self. Possible selves include your visions of the self you dream of becoming, the rich self, the successful self, anything like that. And also the self you fear becoming, who you don't want to be. I don't want to be the lonely self or the failed self, something like that. And pretend play in children is a really, really good way to help imagine different possible versions of the self. So that's a way for children to kind of explore their own personality. One vocab word you need to know in terms of self is the spotlight effect. And it's basically exactly how it sounds. People tend to assume there's like this spotlight shining down on us in terms of we overestimate how much other people are paying attention to us. And I don't mean that in a way of like people are never thinking about you, but I mean it more in a way of like you probably think others are thinking about you more than they really are. Meaning you don't need to be so self-conscious about things all the times. People are not always noticing and evaluating your appearance, your performance, if you mess up on something. Sometimes people notice, but you probably think people notice more than they really do. So, just kind of ease up on yourself. You're probably not getting judged as much as you think that you are. For example, here was a study that was done where at Cornell University, they had some students wear t-shirts that had the face of Barry Manilow on them before they entered a room with other students. Those who wore the shirts guessed that nearly half of their peers would take note of the shirt as they walked by, but only about 23% of the students actually noticed the shirt. So see, we stand out less than we imagine, even when you got something funky going on that day. Absolutely, you need to be able to identify the difference between the terms self-esteem and self-efficacy. I feel like students really confuse these terms a lot, and a lot of times they get misused in our everyday conversations as well. Self-esteem is your feelings of high or low self-worth. So it's how you feel about yourself. Do you think I'm kind of cool, or I don't really like myself? I feel like I don't really matter, something like that. That's your self-esteem. Your self-efficacy, which is not the same thing, is your sense of competence and effectiveness. It's your belief about your ability to do something. Do you think you are able to succeed in this task? So do you think you can pass a hard math test? You can construct a cabinet. You can take care of someone else. Self-efficacy is your belief in your ability to do something. Self-esteem is more how do you feel about yourself. So let's put that to the test now. Which of the following here is an example of self-efficacy? You might need to take a second to pause to read through each of these. But for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and tell you this is letter C. Rashid has placed in skating competitions, which makes him believe he's a competent skater. It's his judgment and evaluation about how well can I accomplish skating. All right, so what are some benefits, though, of high self-esteem? Remember, like your self-worth and everything. People who feel good about themselves have fewer sleepless nights, so you tend to sleep better, succumb less to pressures to easily conform, and are more persistent at difficult tasks. So it is good to make sure that you are being kind to yourself and that you value everything that is great about you. What about the low side of self-esteem, though? Those people tend to be oversensitive and a little more judgmental. However, keep in mind, it's not good to be excessively optimistic either. You can't just be blissful about everything. It's always good to focus on the positive more than the negative, but you don't want to just say everything is good 100% of the time when that's not necessarily true. Excessive optimism can blind us to real risks. You might think, oh, this thing's going to turn out fine, when really, you need to be cautious about some stuff. And more than 1,000 studies have shown that our natural positive thinking bias can promote an unrealistic optimism about future life events. What does it mean to be blind to one's own incompetence? It means that we tend to feel pretty overconfident if you are a bit incompetent. So that kind of leads to this term here of self-serving bias, another important one from this module here. Self-serving bias is a readiness to perceive oneself favorably. So basically, we like to just look at when we do the good things and we kind of ignore the bad things. So you like to take credit more than you like to take blame. So let's look at some things that relate to self-serving bias here. First, let's start with this example. Yeah, I thought that I skipped a slide. Here we go. I want to show you a few examples here. People accept more responsibility for good deeds than for bad, and successes than failure. So athletes often privately credit their victories to their own prowess and their losses to bad breaks, lousy officiating, or the other team's exceptional performance. So if I do really good and my team wins, that was because of me. If we lose, it was because of everybody else. Most students who receive poor test grades criticize the test or the teacher, not themselves. So, think about it. Maybe we're not all as bad as you think we are. Drivers filling out insurance forms have explained their accidents in words such as, "A pedestrian hit me and went under my car." How rude of them to hit your car like that. My goodness. So that's definitely some self-serving bias there. So here we've got another practice question here. On the next slide, we have our answer choices. So look at this scenario. Carl was late to his interview because he left the house late and did not use his GPS for directions. If Carl's making use of the self-serving bias, what might he say to explain his lateness? Here are your answer choices. Take a second to look at them. Again, pause if you're not done reading, but that would be letter C. My GPS told me to turn left when I should have turned right. So it was my GPS's fault. It was not me. That was not my fault at all. That's the self-serving bias. It's also kind of funny the way that this can turn out sometimes, where they've seen in studies that say you have a favorite team. For me, if I'm going to talk about football, I will say the Ravens. So they tend to see that people say if the Ravens win, and I'm just a fan, I'm not even participating in the game at all. I have no effect on the outcome. I'm just a fan of the Ravens. And if the Ravens win, I say, yes, we won. We did so good today. But if the Ravens lose, then I would tend to say, oh, they played horribly. They did so bad. What's the key word that was different in what I said? We versus they. If it was a win, I contribute that to myself. I say, like, I'm part of this team. We did good. If they do bad, I don't want to be part of that. That was they. They did really bad. That was not anything that had to do with me. So it's kind of funny that you don't even have to be involved in it. You have no outcome. And we still like to maintain our self-preservation there. We like to say that I'm pretty good. All right, so we also see here that most people see themselves as better than average. That's another example of a self-serving bias. So if you think about it, what is an average? An average is like the middle of where things fall, yet most people tend to see themselves as better than average, which isn't possible. If everyone's better than average, then that's not the average. You can't all be better than average. But we've seen things like 90% of business managers and more than 90% of college professors rate their performance as superior to that of their average peer. So 90% of people think they're better than average, but average is like the middle, so you can't all be better than average. Also, people rate their job performance as above average, about 86% of people, and only 1% as below average. Well, we know that can't be true. And 49% of men said they provided half or more of the child care, though only 31% of their wives or partners saw things that way. So again, promoting ourselves a bit more. On that topic of self-promotion is the personality trait of narcissism. This is something we'll talk more about next unit with clinical psychology, so I did take this term out of your slide deck. But just briefly, narcissism is excessive self-love and self-absorption. You kind of feel like I'm really, really important. Everything revolves around me. So people with narcissistic personalities tend to be materialistic. They desire fame, have inflated expectations. They hook up more often with people without commitment, and they tend to gamble and cheat more. All of which of those things have been increasing as narcissism has also increased. There's definitely some negative effects with narcissism too. It can be very dangerous in lots of different ways. You can kind of take a look at this, but there's another really important thing that I want to make sure I get to with this module here to wrap up. You can also take a look at secure and defensive self-esteem as well. But this is our last thing here I want to cover, individualism versus collectivism. We have mentioned this a couple times before in a few different contexts, but individualism takes place in cultures where priority is given to one's own goals over group goals and defining one's own identity in terms of personal attributes rather than group identifications. So individualism does not mean you're selfish. It just means your culture values focusing on yourself more than on for the greater good of the group. It can sometimes appear as being selfish, but it's not inherently a selfish thing. Collectivism is when a culture gives priority to the goals of one's group, which could be your extended family, your work group, any kind of group that we're talking about, and defining one's identity accordingly. So we definitely see that Western cultures, such as the United States, we tend to be a more individualistic culture for sure. Whereas a lot of our more Eastern cultures, like for example, a lot of Asian cultures are very collectivistic. That's more focused on the group rather than the self and making sure that I succeed. It's how do we succeed? So characteristics of an individualistic culture are things where you have a big sense of me and an awareness of your own unique personal convictions and values. You prioritize your own personal goals, define your identity mostly in terms of your personal traits, and strive for personal control and individual achievement. Whereas collectivistic cultures tend to provide a sense of belonging, a set of values, and an assurance of security within group identifications. Collectivistic cultures have deep attachments to their groups, their family, clan, or company. Elders receive respect. So as I said, you could definitely identify a lot of Asian cultures with being more collectivistic because it is very common to make sure that you are respecting your elders in Asian cultures. And a lot of times the grandparents might end up living with their children and their grandchildren because it's just a much greater sense of we are a group together rather than it being I need to focus on myself and making sure I am successful in my job or whatever thing that I want. And for example, in terms of responding to a disaster, Japan's collectivistic values, including duty to others and social harmony, were on display after the 2011 earthquake and tsunami. Virtually no looting was reported, and residents remained orderly, as shown above, waiting for drinking water. So just think about if that happened here in the United States, do you think people would be that calm and orderly, waiting their turn for water? Just think about what happened with the COVID pandemic when suddenly we thought there were going to be shortages of toilet paper and everything. So, just throwing the thought out there. You can look at this last chart on your own, but with that, we have one final question. Which of the following is most likely to be true of a person from an individualist culture? Pause if you need to read for another moment. That would be letter A. His behavior would be a reflection of his personality and attitudes rather than focusing on any of these other options that focus more on the group. All right, guys, great work. That is it for unit number 7. Pat yourselves on the back. This was a big one here. So great job. We will come back with our next video talking about unit 8. Awesome work. Let us know if you have any questions and have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. See you later.